All right, that's the stream looks like it's up. I'm gonna start it over on Instagram, maybe. Oh, it's waiting for me to show up. There it is, going live on Instagram. Man, second live today. The last one was about 30 minutes, but I failed to make sure the mic was on. I think I reached up and there's a mute button on this mic. This is a mic that I got for free. It's not, a $5 mic, but it's one I didn't really know I'd ever use, but it's great for this backyard environment. And there's a mute button right here. So I was adjusting in the last stream and touched the mute button. Just a light touch will mute it. So here we are again. But it was a great opportunity. It's nice to just sit and kind of talk, process, and kind of and really just think out loud. And that's what that last stream was for me. Unfortunately, for some reason, I don't see live comments. Someone mentioned that the mic was muted on the last one, but for some reason, StreamYard's not showing me comments. I've seen this happen before. So hopefully this time the mic is on. From what I understand, this mic doesn't really pick up the wind noise. If it does, I apologize. I'm trying it anyway. All right, here we go. I'm going to check this. I'll be able to hear if there's noise. Nope. Oh, nice. Yeah, so for a mic that's kind of generic, I'm pretty impressed with the sound quality, especially with this roaring wind. You can see it in the sail over my head. But anyway, talking about living our calling. Most of the time on my YouTube channel, in these lives, I talk about healing. Healing for me was the first step. For me, the anxiety, depression, daily panic attacks made it impossible to, one, discover my calling, two, to live my calling. Once that got cleared up, my process was I had to clear that up. I know that now in retrospect. Once I cleared that up, it was like I was in an open field. Like, oh, now what? So I just to recap the last stream, I had never, and I didn't know this until after the fact, looking back, but I had never made a decision with autonomy most of my life, age 6 to my early 40s. In retrospect, I was able to look back and realize that my anxiety, depression, all the programming that had been piled on, both by me, by others, by family, by society, the books I read, the media I consumed, all that programming made it impossible for me to discover my purpose, to live my purpose. What I had to do is I had to release the anxiety, the depression, the programming that was causing all this suffering. Once the suffering subsided, then, and this summary comes because I already did this stream and the mic was off, but two things happened. One, my purpose was clear. And I can't say this with certainty for everybody, but at least for me, and if this fits for you, try it on. I had always tried to discover my purpose, but as soon as I cleared up all that stuff that was making decisions for me, anxiety, depression, the incidents from the past that were causing my present struggles, once that cleared up, my purpose was clear. It was right there in front of me. I'm not going to say it was in a moment, and it might have been. I honestly don't remember, but it was fast. I went from clarity or a clear sky. The anxiety, depression had subsided. And very, very rapidly, my purpose became obvious. So it was no longer a search. I didn't have to read books. I didn't have to journal for hours and hours, as great as that is. As soon as I cleared up the deep programming, the core wounds, the trauma that was affecting me every single day of my life, as soon as I cleared up, my purpose became clear in an instant, figuratively speaking. Then I tell the story in almost every stream. Over here, I'm in my back porch, in front of the neighbor's house. I was walking Taffy the dog, and I paused for a moment because I did that internal gaze. I kind of just, while walking, just felt, I stopped, and I recognized that it felt like I was 7 years old again, but it was like I was 6 years old again prior to the core wound. And it felt like I was standing in an open field, endlessly stretching, beautiful blue sky overhead, sun shining down, endless openness, but I had no idea what to do next. It wasn't scary. It wasn't bad. But I literally felt like, oh, now I have to start making decisions. I don't have the luxury of anxiety, crushing anxiety and depression, telling me what decision to make next. And from there, once I'd cleared up using retrocession, this process I discovered, once I cleared that up, then my purpose became obvious. And if you're watching this, you're watching my purpose unfold. I've known since that early day, 4 years ago, roughly, I've known what my purpose was. And if I put it into one word, repeated 3 times, because I love repetition of 3, but one word, communicate. Now, obviously, communicate what? And what I mean by communicate is not think and say words that I think about. What I mean by communicate is get out of the way and allow spirit to flow. Now, it involves my life. I'm here because of the pain that I suffered from for all those years. I'm here because of the trauma. I'm here because all those problems, supposed problems, they led me to a place where I can understand and empathize. And then I was given a solution. And now my purpose is to present that solution. It doesn't mean that I heal anybody. I do not heal a single person, never have. But I get to see miracles happen in the chair in my office, sometimes other places, every single week, most of the time, multiple times a week. And that is a gift. That is a gift. I know my purpose, and I now I understand the steps to take. So once the purpose became clear, that wasn't the end. As I really just hinted, discovered my purpose after clearing all the trauma, the pain, the suffering. But then after the trauma's gone, it's like, okay, well, what do I do now? So I'm in this open field. It stretches as far as the eye can see, infinite possibility. How do I decide where to go? Well, then it turned out that this process, retrocession, can help with that. And it's the same process, but no, every session is totally different. There is a distinct 3-step process, but it's different every single person, every single session. It's not directed by me. And it's not directed by the client. It's directed by the intersection of the two of us. So I hold space. I support, I give suggestions, and all the work is happening there in the chair. So that work, those steps, that process, it's the personalized process that can take us to a place where the trauma's gone. Now we figure out what our purpose is. It comes out. And I'm not saying it's like this for everyone. Maybe some people will have to do a little soul searching after they release the stuff that's holding them back, or the stuff that's holding them back from discovering their purpose. But then the next step comes, and that next step is figuring out what to do next. And here's how retrocession helped with that process for me. So a way you could visualize it is if there's something covering your eyes. That was the trauma. That was the pain. That was all the programming that had been installed by others, myself, society, family, trauma, incidents. That was the stuff that was right here. It was blocking my view of what is and what possibility there is. And then a little further away is another type of programming. It's not as heavy. It's not as apparently painful, but it's there nonetheless. And this programming is usually much more subtle. It's not always subtle. By subtle, I mean this early trauma often kind of stretches back in time to a first time I experienced a sensation, an emotion. And then it builds from there. So the first time I experienced this sensation, trauma, pain, mental suffering, it's like a root has been planted or a seed has been planted. And then the next time something happens that reminds me of that, or something for some reason attaches itself to that early experience. And then this tree starts to build, and the trunk, and then the branches, and out on the edges. Now I have this tree built of trauma, built of difficult experiences. And now so easy for new things to attach. New things trigger me. New things set me off. So that's kind of the main thing. But there's the secondary thing, and it's much more subtle. So in that stuff, the trauma is kind of singular. Most of the time we can go back and find the first time that we experienced that pain, that anxiety, that stress, and we can clear that up. What I'm talking about now is further away. So we remove the scales from our eyes. We remove the covering that's blocking us from seeing things as they are. Now we have this other covering a little further out. And by subtle, I mean, it's not usually just a single moment in time. It's not, a moment of being injured or yelled at or experiencing something very difficult, having an accident. It's usually a long series of choices, a long series of things that we've said to ourselves, that others have said to us. And often the stuff we say to ourselves is learned from others. But it's often a chain of those things. And so that's what's left. We get rid of the trauma, the heavy stuff that's right up front. Now we have this other blockade. And I keep doing this for a reason. So let's say that initial trauma happens, and then let's just say that's at a very young age, 4 or 5 years old. And then there's something else that happens, and I'm a teenager and I'm made fun of in school and it causes deep pain, and just on and on and on. And then we have this hand here and it weaves together and it covers our light. It's the simplest way to put it. This other layer, though, isn't as simple, and it often manifests as a general sense. How do I put it? So in retrocession, we rewind essentially and go back to these early moments in life that affected us and affect us to this day. And then we erase the emotional charge on that, and it seems to clear everything that kind of attached itself going up to the present moment. In these examples where it's like a pattern, most people will, and this is, I'll say it. I usually don't say these things because I don't want to, if somebody does see this and then comes to a session, I think it's okay. It often comes up as spontaneously. Someone will say to me, and this happens all the time, they'll say, well, I don't see one thing, but I see a bunch of things flashing before my imagination, before my eyes. And it's not necessarily one thing. And I'll say, that's great. Perfect. Just stick with that. Just know there's a series of things. And sometimes that happens with the trauma. It can be a series of traumas and people will experience it. But more often it's a single thing that we can trace back to when we go back to the earliest example of it. For the secondary level of programming, for the thinking patterns, that is more often that series. And so we're kind of clearing up that series rather than an individual thing that was the root of all this pain that stretches out to right now. So once, in the same way that your purpose can become clear after taking away the anxiety, depression, the trauma, the heavy experiences that have happened, this secondary layer, the patterns, and this is generalized. There are other ways this can happen, but this is kind of seems to be a typical experience. That second layer, we use the same process. It does tend to look different in practice, but it still has the same 3 steps. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But when that happens often, and for me specifically, once we clear up those thinking patterns, we can experience it as like bubbles popping, and it's wild when it happens. And I don't tell people before sessions this can happen. I've seen it happen over and over and over again, and it makes me think there is something common to most of us as human beings. And so what happens is we clear that programming, that series of this thinking pattern that we have that's stopping us from realizing our purpose. And it literally feels like bubbles popping, or it can be like flashes of memory, rapid succession. Oh, all these times I thought this way. Once we clear that up with retrocession, just as clearing up the trauma brought the purpose out, our purpose out without much work, once those thinking patterns clear, the direction to head becomes clear. So it's not that you don't have to think. It's not that you just know, but a reservoir of infinite creativity and wisdom opens up. The light within, I'll call it that. We can call it any number of things. Higher self. You could call it conscience, intuition, whatever the case may be. It's covered by that trauma. It's covered by the thinking patterns. It's covered by other things, but not the topic of this video. Once we take away those thinking patterns that we've become accustomed to, a reservoir of wisdom, a reservoir of creativity opens up. And this is what I said at the beginning. I'm at my best when I get out of the way. Clearing up trauma, clearing up anxiety, depression, then clearing up thinking patterns that are no longer needed. Frankly, thinking patterns, I've never seen thinking patterns that were useful. But anyway, once that clears, we have that source of wisdom that comes up spontaneously. You don't have to make it come up. You don't have to follow a series of steps. Once you get out of the way, it's just there. And that's when the purpose and the direction we need to step becomes obvious. Then the challenge is the ego mind wants to insert itself and grab control, and it doesn't do a very good job, at least for me. Maybe you're different. My ego doesn't do a very good job of managing things. Life is heaven when I get out of the way. It's hell when I get in the way and try to control, when I'm seizing control. Have you known somebody like that? Are you like that? Do you find yourself trying to seize control everything, controlling other people's experiences, trying to control other people's reactions, trying to control the way people treat you, trying to control their behaviors, trying to control any aspect of other people's lives, trying to control aspects of your own life that are out of your control? It's never going to work. It's never going to work. It's never going to work ever. It's the root of suffering. The ego's attempt to control. And so if we can get out of the way, and access this infinite reservoir of wisdom and intelligence and creativity, things are going to go a lot easier. Some people would say suffering is a choice, and I absolutely disagree. Who's going to choose to suffer? That's a kind of bypass that I really dislike in self-help and spirituality. Oh, well, I don't know what their purpose was in being here. I don't know what my purpose was being here. Maybe suffering is part of it. Maybe. But for me, that suffering is the friction created by my ego trying to change what is, trying to direct the flow of things that it has no control over, being disappointed, being attached to results that it has no ability to accrue, to create. That's the root of suffering. And frankly, the reason I say suffering is not a choice is it really isn't. Like I said earlier, and I've said it in almost every stream, I didn't realize how little autonomy I had until the anxiety and depression cleared up, because anxiety was controlling and something deeper, but it's easier to put it that way. Anxiety made my decisions for me until there was no anxiety. Then I had to figure out how to make decisions, but it's far easier than I realized at the time. Get out of the way was the answer that I fell upon. So once we clear up the pain, the suffering, the anxiety, depression, the big stuff, the stuff that's truly weighting us down, then we can choose to start working on thinking patterns and start to clear those up using the same process, though it can look slightly different. We clear up those thinking patterns, and then the way is clear. But I don't want anybody to take what I'm saying on faith. That's not my goal here. You don't have to believe anything. I say this as kind of there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And to heal, to break those thinking patterns, to heal, then break thinking patterns that are holding us back, there's two things that are required at the beginning of that path. It's simple. Number one, believe it's possible. If I don't believe it's possible for me to heal, I'm guaranteed not to heal. So when I say my anxiety and depression disappeared, I know from experience that frankly pisses some people off. It's not a choice. It's not a choice. I was catatonic with depression. I'm not somebody who was just kind of sad sometimes. I was clinically depressed. I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder. I didn't go for a day without anxiety. I didn't go for a week without a crushing panic attack. And at the end, I had panic attacks every day. So I'm not coming from a place where life was great and everything was easy. And I'm telling you, no. But you got to believe it's possible. And I'm living proof. That's why I do these lives. That's why I talk this way. I've had to go out of my comfort zone because I've had people get angry with me. I've been yelled at and screamed at by somebody because I said this stuff I'm saying here. And finally, I've gotten out of the way and said, you know what? That's just be it what it is. It's fine. But so that's the first thing. Believing it's possible to heal. I'm not talking about blind faith, but just believing maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel, maybe not seeing it. And second, willingness. Willingness seems easy, but it's not as easy. At least for me, it wasn't as easy as it sounded. So I would have told you all those years of just abject pain and suffering. I would have told you that I was willing to heal. But maybe I mean something a little kind of specific about healing here, what healing is or willingness is. Willingness to feel better is one thing. That's not what I'm talking about. Everybody has a willingness to feel better. Nobody wants to suffer. And there may be some exceptions. And I suppose I was an exception at times. But in general, I did not want to suffer. So it's not that kind of willingness. This is the willingness to do what it takes. But I'm not talking about do what it takes, like do a particular technique to get rid of it. That's not it at all. It's a willingness to change as needed to get that healing. And here's what I mean by that. What I wanted at my worst time, what I wanted was to feel better, but I didn't want to change anything about who I was. My ego wanted to remain static, but just kind of subtract the suffering. And what I mean by willingness is being willing to release the suffering, but being willing to release the identity, the thinking patterns, the behavior patterns, the coping mechanisms that have kind of kept us safe all these years. They haven't done a great job, but they've kind of done their thing. But being willing to release all of it without exception, that's what I mean by willingness. So belief that it's possible, and then willingness to do what it takes, or to surrender. In other words, to willingness, surrender is a great word for it. Willingness or belief, and then surrender. The only thing that you have to believe, though, I really mean this, the only thing you have to believe is that it's possible. Nothing else is required. Belief, knowledge are absolutely not in the slightest requirements for healing, other than the belief it's possible. Knowledge is never going to heal. More thinking is not the way out. Thinking, and we can't go into details, there's not time, but thinking is what got us here in the first place, to a place of deep suffering and pain. Or, if we're not talking about pain, feeling stuck and unable to live our purpose or discover our purpose. Thinking is what got us there, and it's not going to get us out. Thinking is what got us to this place where change is needed, and it's not going to get us out. Knowledge is great. I'm not saying knowledge is a problem. I'm not saying thinking is a problem. Not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is it's not going to heal. The next book, knowledge, learning about some spiritual technique, learning about the technical aspects of yoga or meditation, I can tell you from personal experience. And that's what all this is. It's personal experience. It's not universal. I don't know. But for me, I could read every text on yoga, every text on meditation, every spiritual book, every scripture in history, and understand it all intellectually, and it will not heal me. It will only reduce my pain temporarily if it allows me to bypass for a little bit. And I'm going to extend that a little further. By itself, meditation, yoga, prayer, I'll say it, prayer. I'm going to say it again, prayer. They're never going to lead directly to healing. Now, those things can be a part of the healing process, but without surrender, worthless to permanent healing. All those things can provide symptom relief. And symptom relief is such a beautiful thing. It's beautiful that we can get enough relief, some space in our lives to start the deep, true, permanent healing process. We need that space. Most of what I do publicly, events I hold, they're for symptom relief. There's some real healing that happens, but their primary purpose is symptom relief. Because real healing, really breaking those cycles that keep us stuck, that keep us from discovering and living our purpose, it's permanent. It's permanent. It's deep. It's profound. Anything that's temporary, that roller coastering, I think I mentioned it in the description for this live. If it's a roller coaster, it's not healing. It doesn't mean it's wrong. But if something is causing a roller coaster where, I feel, I'm finally getting better. Oh, never mind. Oh, I'm finally getting better. Oh, never mind. Oh, I discovered oh, never mind. If that cycle has been repeating, we're not healing. That doesn't mean it's bad. If there's a technique that's doing that, freaking beautiful. I used to go to hot yoga classes and bust my ass because I knew I was so depressed. I could barely drag myself out of bed, go to the car, drive to the yoga studio, and walk in, sign in, lay down on the floor in that hot studio, looking up toward the ceiling tiles, the heater panels. And I knew that if I made it to the first moment that words came out of the teacher's mouth, that I'd be okay for the next 24 hours, roughly, probably more like 20 hours. I'd be okay. Not perfect, but I'd be okay. But then I had to go back the next day because sure enough, by the time I woke up the next morning, that weight was coming down on me. That crushing sense of anxiety and fear, depression, even panic attacks had come back. But I knew if I could make it there, I'd live for another day. So I'm not saying symptom relief is a problem, but it's so important to recognize on this healing journey that healing and symptom relief are two different things, and to understand what to look for, to understand whether something is actually healing us or just allowing for some symptom relief. So meditation, yoga, prayer, reading, like self-help books, going to self-help workshops, spiritual workshops, various spiritual techniques. I'm not making a statement about any of those techniques in particular. I'm just giving a kind of a mechanism that I used in the past to discover whether I was actually healing. So if it's a up and down, up and down, up and down, the same up and down over and over again, not healing, at least in my opinion. Now, so I'm using that same example with fingers. These are the individual traumas, and we'll just stick with drama for now, but it could be thinking patterns and a whole host of things. But they've woven together into this blanket that covers, or garbage pile that covers our light, our purpose. And then when we really release it, let's say this is one of those incidents in our life, the deepest trauma. Let's call this the core wound. That's gone. I still have the other ones, but so that one finger is out of the way. Now let's get rid of another one. So now I have 4 fingers here. My pain is not the same. My behavior is not the same. Things are different. They're not all the way fixed necessarily, but they're different. And still, maybe I have some rough spots. So I'm not saying there's not going to be ups and downs. There's ups and downs even when you've made it to the what I'd call the end of the healing process. There's still ups and downs. But they don't cause suffering, at least at the end. But these ups and downs, as you heal, there will be ups and downs, but the general trajectory is going to be toward peace, toward openness, toward love, toward freedom. But if the general trajectory is, I feel better. Oh no, that is not healing. If something's helping, great, but it's symptom relief. Once the real healing starts, then it kind of compounds. And to me, it's not scientific. I didn't mathematically study it at this point, but it seems to be on an exponential curve, because as we clear up some of the big stuff, I take it back. There's a little bump right in the beginning. If we go after the core wound early, it makes it easier to work on the rest of the stuff, by the way. Not quite the topic here, but so we have a little bump. It's like, oh my gosh, I have space. And some people stop there, and that's beautiful. If you want to stop there, life is pretty damn manageable. At least it was for me. But there's that little bump, and then there's an exponential curve. We start working through all this other programming, the stuff, the trauma, the thinking patterns, all that. And eventually, everything that clears up makes it easier to clear the other stuff up. Everything that clears up gives space to work on other stuff. And so eventually the exponential curve, and I'll illustrate it here if math isn't something you're into, it'll eventually go like this. It'll bump up. Suddenly there's an exponential decrease, I could say, in suffering. Suddenly the world looks like a different place. So it's not that there's not a little bit of up and down, but it's the same up and down over and over again. Not healing. Not bad. It's just not healing. So if we apply the healing process, we get to the place where our purpose in life is obvious. We don't have to search for it anymore. It becomes clear. Once we've removed that blanket that's covering our light, our purpose, it's gone. Now our purpose shines forth and we don't have to search anymore. We don't have to guess. We don't have to journal endlessly. We don't have to read books, work through workbooks, self-help workbooks. It doesn't mean there won't be some work in refining the purpose, but it becomes obvious. And then now to access that deep reservoir of wisdom, creativity, intelligence that helps us live that purpose, now we start erasing the thinking patterns. Man, those things, you'd think the trauma is harder to get rid of. In my experience with myself and others, it's actually the thinking patterns that are harder to release than the trauma. My theory is that the trauma is just bad. It sucks. Excuse me. The trauma sucks. And so it's a little easier to wrap your head around. I want to release this. Let's be done with it. But but thinking patterns are active while we're trying to solve the problem. So the thinking pattern itself gets involved in its own perpetuation. And so the thinking pattern tries to preserve itself in the same way the ego is constantly trying to preserve itself. Thinking patterns are just part of the ego, and it will perpetuate itself as long as it can. It wants to live eternally. It wants to perpetuate itself. It's not reasonable. It's not rational. Doesn't think that way, if you will, but it wants to perpetuate itself. So the challenge of the ego is the challenge of thinking patterns. So releasing these thinking patterns, and we can do that, as I said earlier in the stream, we can do that with retrocession, this process I discovered as I came out of my absolute bottom. It can be used to release the trauma, the big stuff, the pain, the suffering. It can also be used to remove the thinking patterns. The process kind of looks a little different on the surface, but it's really the same 3 phases. And I'll get to that in a moment. But once that reservoir of wisdom, of love, of intelligence, of creativity opens up, and we just get out of the way, life flows perfectly. Everything is perfect as it is. If there's, and like I said earlier, I'm not trying to tell people what to believe, but if there's something to kind of gnaw on, everything is perfect as it is. But there's this covering over it. Expectations, pain, suffering, thinking patterns. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about retrocession. So this is the process I discovered. My life was a massive anxiety. It started at an early age, 6 years old, due to a particular trauma. That anxiety continued up until the point where I released it a few years ago, 4 years ago, roughly. And it got worse and worse, especially at the end. It turned into daily panic attacks. It was, even back in my 20s, there would be three days at a time where I didn't do anything. I just laid around depressed. Those depressive episodes got more frequent and they were longer. Life was unmanageable, unbearable. Like I said, clinical depression, clinical anxiety. I'm not somebody who's coming at you saying, hey, I healed. And I just my dad yelled at me once and I was just kind of sad. No, I was literally, I was as close to catatonic as you can be while still being able to move just a little bit. I was catatonic at times, just staring at a wall, barely moving. And then I discovered retrocession, and there's plenty of times on YouTube. There's videos on YouTube where I talk about that discovery. I won't go into the details. I think there's even lives where I've done that. Check out my YouTube channel, other social media. I really don't post on social media much, but there's a lot of stuff on YouTube. And then you have these lives. But if you want to hear more about how I discovered retrocession, just suffice it to say, I discovered something that not only could pinpoint the source of my pain, it could erase the emotional charge associated with that source and permanently eliminate it. So retrocession is usually a one-on-one process. I'll talk at the end about group retrocession, which is coming up. But one-on-one's the most effective because I can look at somebody as we're going through the session. I can see physical manifestations, their body doing things. I can see their looking at their face, I can see what's going on, and they don't even know what's going on. And I don't say it here because if someone hears this and then comes in for a session, I don't want to poison the well. I don't want to give them preconceived notions about what's going to happen, because every single person that comes in goes through this particular arc of this session. Every single person. It's ridiculous. I don't tell anybody what it is. I don't talk about it, because it's always the same regardless. And there's certain manifestations. Now, not everybody does every manifestation, but there are common manifestations from person to person. So in person is best, because then I can direct the session. In-person individual is best, because then I can direct the session. Second option is live video. I did that for the first time. Well, the first time since I've been doing this professionally. I did one session online once a long time ago at the beginning of doing this with other people, but it wasn't, it was the experimental phase. But I've done one real session over the internet this week, and it was the best session I've ever had. So I've been really resistant to doing streaming one-on-one sessions, but now I've just dropped that resistance, because it's easier in a way, but apparently it doesn't matter. So we can do those remotely. We can also do group, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. First phase is relaxation. If you've come to one of my yoga classes, one of my workshops, something like that, just studio yoga classes, that's a big emphasis in the class. We work real hard in yoga and then relax. In meditation, it's all about getting as relaxed as possible. And relaxation is a cool thing. Not going to go on that tangent right now. Maybe next time I'll talk about relaxation. It's so amazing. Oh, it's so amazing what relaxation can do. And you can always relax more. That's the cool thing. It's not, oh, I'm relaxed, done. No. You can keep going. But anyway, that's the first phase, relaxation. Some people do not need a long, involved relaxation session. Sometimes, for somebody who's able to just drop it and just relax immediately, we don't even have a distinct first phase of retro session. I've had recent sessions. I've had many sessions, particular people where we're talking, and just our conversation, I'll just say at some point, okay, why don't you just close your eyes? And then we go right into it. It's not a formal relaxation phase, but that's number one, relaxation. Number two, I call locating, finding the root. So it's different for everybody. It's different for every session with a particular person, but there's a few things we can target in retro session. One of the most effective, it's not essential, but one of the most effective is if we can find a physical sensation. So if someone is struggling with anxiety, as an example, my question is going to be, what does that feel like in your body? If someone is, even if they have a thinking pattern, or they have a behavior pattern, or a relationship that's a problem, I'm always going to start with that. I'm going to say, what do you feel in your body, and get them to really get into it and describe the outlines of that sensation. Does it move? Is it static? Does it come and go? Does it change places in the body? We want to just be there with it. And frankly, the purpose behind that is not that you have to have the outlines in mind. Not that at all. The purpose is to be there with it and face it, frankly. To be open to this pain. So that's, we find the pain in the locating phase, and then we find its origin. Most often, and I'm saying a vast majority of the time, we find an event from the past that originated this series of things that led to this place right now. So it's never something happened to me when I was 6, period, the end. It's always we find that thing at 6 or whatever age it is. Could be 20. I've had people that had something a little later, but often it's earlier, especially the core wound. And then there's a whole series of events that came after that day that attached to the first one. So we want to find the earliest one. It's like a tree. If you can imagine the initial trauma, we build up this tree of trauma with all these leaves at the end. And if we cut off leaves, we prune the tree a little bit, or not prune, but if we take the leaves off, doesn't really have an overall huge effect. We can prune the tree, cutting branches. Great. There's change, but we still have that root, and it's really not going to radically change somebody's life. So we go for the root, and we get to the root by finding the origin. Origin is almost all the time an event in life Not always. I won't go into that, but it's almost always an event. But do you have to remember that event with detail? Do you have to know everything that happened, every detail? Absolutely not. There seems to be an ability of the subconscious. The subconscious knows what's wrong and it knows how to fix it, actually, believe it or not. But the subconscious is that light. The intuition is that light that's covered by all this stuff the conscious mind is doing, all this program it's running on. So if we get beneath the conscious mind, the subconscious knows exactly where to go and exactly what to do. And so the relaxation, the first phase, is about getting this conscious mind out of the way. I have lots of techniques for doing that. Everybody is different. Subconscious gets involved. And as long as the conscious mind doesn't come back in and try to pull the strings, the subconscious is going to surface eventually the origin of this pain, the suffering, anxiety, depression, sensation, habit, pattern. It's always going to do it. It can always do it. I've never seen a case where it couldn't, as long as the conscious mind can get out of the way, as long as the ego can get out of the way. So we now locate that origin, and we're just going to assume it's an event in life because it's easier and that's common. And then we do something called sweeping integration. Sweeping integration is the part of the process where we actually permanently eliminate the emotional charge on that event. It doesn't mean we erase the memory, but that memory, speaking for myself, my experience, and describing, I guess, the experience people tell me about that sit in my chair, that thing is in living color. It's visuals. We see it, we hear it, we remember it. But most importantly, there's emotion attached to it. And it's not just emotion, because I can remember an emotion, but I can also re-experience emotion, especially a negative emotion. And that's what gets triggered. Somebody says the wrong thing to me, comes up anger, no possibility of stopping that anger from coming out. Or the anger comes up and I stuff it, but I still feel it. That's a trigger. Every time it's a trigger. And we can get to the initial triggering event and we can clear it. So now we've located and we do that clearing process, that sweeping integration. I'm not going to do it here, though. I will probably be doing a stream like this with some sweeping integration. Sweeping integration by itself is an amazing process. It can be used standalone. It feels dang good. Now, in an actual retro session, the sweeping integration is a releasing process. So there's tough stuff that happens, but by itself, sweeping integration is amazing. It's so much fun. It feels so good if you can get into it. Sweeping integration, we continue that until complete release, at least in one-on-one cases. And if there's a fourth stage, that's really bringing people back into their body, bringing back into the present moment, back into the room. Nowadays, I do try to bring some energy back to people because, and there's only so much I can do. Most people after a retro session, they kind of want some alone time. They kind of want to be quiet. A lot of people like to go out in nature, be by themselves for a little while. And then maybe it's the fifth phase is integration. There's three main phases in the session in the room, but integration is probably the most important part. And I tell everybody at the end of a session, it's going to take you days, it's going to take you weeks, potentially years, months to years to integrate this session. My personal experience is that doesn't mean you need to wait for another session until you've integrated, because you might be waiting lots of years. You can stack session upon session. Frankly, this is how I did it for myself, and I know most people aren't going to do this. I did retro session on myself, hours and hours every day, 7 days a week. Once it started working, I was like, oh, I am in. That willingness I talked about earlier, no problem for me at that time, because I was so desperate. Life had become so unmanageable that when I discovered something that worked, something that was permanently erasing these issues, I jumped in full bore. So I didn't take integration time, individual integration time. I was integrating the early experience. I integrated that core wound. I probably still integrating that, the release of that core wound. But I released it and then started on other and just released all along this chain from the biggest to the smallest things that were affecting me, that were forcing my hand. In other words, programming, the pain, the suffering, everything that was generating that, the expectations. And there's more beyond that, but now's not the time. Maybe I'll talk about it someday publicly. but we have the, the pain that I was talking about earlier, the trauma. We can release that. We can release thinking patterns, which are a little bit further out. So we release the pain. Now we can see our thinking patterns, release those. There's more stuff that can be released later, but the further out the stuff is that we're releasing in this model I'm using of close, further, the closer it is to our face, the more it's covering up reality. So starting out here with stuff way out, it's pointless because this stuff covering our face is blocking our vision of what is and who we really are. But anyway, that's the retrocession process. I lead people through it one-on-one. That's the primary mechanism. I also do some things publicly. So far, I have done a kind of retrocession publicly, but not this. Shortly, and I kind of have the flyer done for it, but I am going to start a once a month live in-person public retrocession. It'll be limited to probably 6 people, at least in the beginning, but this is group retrocession. So it's not as tailored as individual retrocession because I can't tailor it to all 6 people. It has to be a generalized process. It will release trauma. I know that from working with people in groups. It will release trauma permanently. It's just not going to be as powerful. It's not going to be as quick. And there may be some additional work that has to happen later, but it will work miracles potentially. So group retrocession limited to 6 participants. It's going to be at my office. Look for a post on that. Like I said, I'm almost done with I might be able to even show that. I won't try to do it, but look for my social media. I'm going to announce it. It's going to be on a Friday, most likely in the evening, early evening, but it's going to be in the evening on a Friday at my office, limited to 6 people. It's an opportunity to relax. So worst case, you relax. If nothing else works, you'll be super relaxed when you leave. Get a good night's rest. You will relax. You'll potentially locate the source of something, and then most likely at least start to work on eliminating it. The instructions I give in public group retrocession are intended to speak to the subconscious mind and say, hey, you're in a group. Only release what you know that the conscious mind can handle. Because if you can handle crying and rolling around on the ground in front of people, maybe that'll happen. But that's only if you can handle it. You will not experience anything you can't handle in group retrocession. I say that with confidence. You don't have to approach anything. In person, one-on-one, if somebody's resisting something, I will usually encourage them to go after it. In public retrocession, I frequently say, hey, if you're experiencing something that feels too deep for a group setting, you are free to just swipe that to the side and find something easier. The cool thing is that retrocession, I don't really do it for this purpose most of the time because I'm going after the deep stuff, deep thinking patterns, deep pain. But I use it this way personally. If an embarrassing thing happens, I give it time. I sit with the embarrassment. I'm not trying to run away from the embarrassment. I want to sit with it. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, I sit with it. And then I know when I'm done sitting with it and I've gotten everything I can get out of it, I get all the help, and then I sweep it. Really, it's just sweeping integration, the last part of the process. It will permanently erase that embarrassment. You know, those things that, at least for me as a kid, would keep me up as a teenager, 20s, 30s, maybe even early 40s. I'd stay up half the night thinking about this thing I did. Retrocession, specifically sweeping integration, can permanently erase that embarrassment. It will not be an issue anymore. And you could lay there in bed after you've erased it. It's so cool. You lay there in bed and you've thought about it and it triggered you, but then you do this process. And once if you've done it fully, you think about that event, you remember it, but you get triggered by it and you can just sleep like a baby. So anyway, that's the retrocession process. Look for that group retrocession. Limited participation, 6 people. It's going to cost, I think I'm going to charge $20 for it. I'm not 100% on that, but it's probably $20. We'll say a suggested donation of $20. If you can't afford it, once you see that come up, just please let me know. I'm willing to let some people come for less than $20, or honestly for free if you can't afford it. If you're struggling and you want some relief, just please let me know. So look for that. The other things that I lead: Tuesday meditation, 11:30 to 12 at my office. Sunday here in 10 Bears Martial Arts. You can see it over there. on Sundays. Look for that on social media. I'm going to post this week with new information about Sundays, but look for that. That's another opportunity. If you were here for the earlier part of the stream, the stuff that's blocking our light, it's a way to temporarily open it to see the light. And yes, all that trauma, the thinking patterns, they come back. It's symptom relief. But once you get a glimpse of what's possible, then you can walk the path toward that possibility. Thank you so much for being here live when I hit that mute button. Thank you for coming back. I'm going to go and erase that because I don't want people to like think it's their computer. So I think I erased it on, it's not on Instagram. I got to go to Facebook and X and YouTube and erase that earlier live. But thank you for being here. I'm going to do much more of this. I'm definitely doing one tomorrow. I think tomorrow's 4th of July, right? Yep. Tomorrow's 4th of July. I'll be doing a live on 4th of July, probably on the 5th as well. I'm going to be doing a lot more of them. Please come back. They'll always be saved on YouTube, and I believe they're also saved on Facebook and X, but I don't know those platforms as well. But you can always go to the lives on my YouTube channel at Retro Session Works. You'll find links to that everywhere. But thank you so much. I really mean it. Like I said at the beginning of this live, this is part of my process, stepping out, living my purpose. And part of that living my purpose is speaking honestly like this, being vulnerable, saying things that I know in the past have pissed people off, frankly, but speaking truth, my truth, talking about my experience honestly without pulling punches. Thank you. Thank you for being a teacher in that way. Thank you for being open to this. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You are the light of the world. In the light, there can be no darkness.